Successful companies in the battery material space usually have deep relationships with their suppliers. That, according to McKinsey. Last month, graphite-focused NextSource Materials signed a 10-year deal with thyssenkrupp Materials Trading. The company's been a role adding mining giant Mick Davis as chair in March. NextSource is up 542% for the year. CEO is Craig Scherba. Craig, welcome to Kitco.
Thank you for inviting us, Michael.
Let's start with that supplier deal, which really elevated the stock. What is thyssenkrupp Materials and what can NextSource provide them?
thyssenkrupp is a very large conglomerate that does mostly steel industry type things. People are probably familiar with them for the elevators that they ride into, or else the escalators, for example. But they do supply a lot of steel products around North America and, well, the world really. I think they've got 1,400 offices all over the world right now. They're one of the largest refractory grade graphite traders in the world. They do about 60,000 tons of that per year. So that essentially they're one of the largest graphite traders outside of China, which is very significant for us because the largest market driver for the graphite industry is the refractory industry. It's about 2/3 of the graphite industry right now. And that's the tried and true kind of bread and butter. And to have a Western-based, very kind of large nameplate group like thyssenkrupp involved, and for them to want to have extra phase development as well for the long term was very important for us moving forward.
I think your corporate development person was talking about bifurcation. So you had thyssenkrupp, which was taking one source of materials from NextSource, and then you're also providing a Japanese company with battery grade graphite material.
Yes, essentially, basically we're developing our project in phases. So the first phase, actually, we started construction 3 months ago. The project is based in Madagascar. The first phase is 17,000 tons. Roughly half of that production will go to thyssenkrupp, and that goes into the refractory industry. The other half is going towards a Japanese trader, which really kind of plugs into the Tesla supply chain. And that's a very important, obviously, growing industry, the whole graphite industry, because graphite's the anode, of course, and lithium-ion batteries. But what people don't often realize is there's a very extensive qualification procedure involved with qualifying your graphite, especially with the OEMs. And so to have a group that actually does the processing, supplies right into the Hitachi, Panasonic, Tesla supply chain, as well as all of the OEMs in Japan as well, is a huge boon for us because what they want is an additional 20,000 tons as well. So the first phase of the operation that the Japanese group will get will go into the qualification run. About 2,000 tons goes into the Tesla supply chain. They'll put it in vehicles and run it around for a year. Once it passes that basic hurdle, that will trigger a 20,000 ton offtake. So all of the mine development is based in phases so we can grow organically with our offtakers' needs.
I want to get into that battery material space more and just talk about how you actually service that and then also what the opportunity is there. But if we could take a step back for a minute, can you explain what graphite mining is? I mean, how is it different, say, from a lithium, copper, even like a coal mining operation?
Well, I guess the traditional commodities most people follow. I mean, obviously, Kitco is very incentivized in that. The traditional commodities are basically on exchanges. And so you can get pricing on the internet. You can find out what the pricing is. I mean, lithium actually is even on exchanges right now. I think it's on the LME in March of this year. Graphite is not. So graphite pricing, it's a very opaque market. You have to have an arrangement already, a sales agreement in place, and you negotiate the price basically one-on-one. So it's very opaque in that manner. The other kind of difficulty about the graphite market is it's not just the purity of the product. It's the purity of the product, of course, but it's also the size of the product. So there's a flake size distribution portion as well. And then if you're going into different markets, there's other esoteric type of scientific things that you require as well. For example, in the lithium-ion battery market, you need charge capacity. If you're going to expand a graphite foil, for example, all the telephone screens, all of the computer screens, television screens that you see, they have a graphite foil sheet in the back. That's called thermal expansion. The graphite has to have a special criteria for that. And then, of course, thermal conductivity if you're looking in the refractory industry as well. So there's a number of different criteria that you have to basically check off all the boxes for in the graphite industry, which is a little bit different than the traditional commodities that people really look at.
Now you're in Madagascar. Is there any type of what you would say? Is there like kind of like there is an Athabasca for uranium? It just seems like there's these graphite mines that are all over the world. Is there any particular characteristics or any particular regions for finding graphite?
Yeah, absolutely. So it kind of goes back to how graphite is formed. So graphite is formed under very high temperatures and very high pressures. So the reason the graphite is used in the refractory industry, it has a melting temperature of 3,600 degrees Celsius. And how it's actually formed is you get some kind of carbon-based material that could start off as a precursor of coal or oil, or it doesn't really matter what the carbon content usually starts with originally anyways. But what you do is subject it to very high temperatures. It boils off all of the volatiles. You're just left with carbon. And then the high pressure aligns all the carbon molecules into sheets of graphite. So what you're looking for is very high grade metamorphic terrain, so granulite facies, really kind of metamorphism is what you're looking at. Madagascar is quite unique in the fact that where we're located in the south is what's called a transpressive shear system. So when you had the formation of Gondwana lands, you had India on one side of Madagascar and the African continent on the other. They were basically sandwiched together, and that whole suture system gave you the pressure and the high temperatures. And so we are, I guess, blessed with a lot of graphite. We have over 300 line kilometers of graphite mineralization on our property, and it's all very large flake, very high purity. So if you're really looking for graphite deposit, you're looking in high-grade metamorphic environments. That's why, for example, in Eastern Canada, there's a lot of graphite deposits. You're looking in northern China as well.
Now, you mentioned the two supply streams. You had the refractory that was happening with thyssenkrupp, and then you also had the Japanese automaker, which was talking about batteries. Can you step back? What is the demand picture for graphite right now? I mean, it must obviously be growing with which is happening with EVs.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's about 800 to 900,000 tons per year of this is natural flake graphite. That market is basically broken off into three different segments. The largest portion of that market is the refractory industry. That takes about 2/3 of the graphite demand right now. That's a tried and true industry. It grows at about 2 to 3% per year. So basically, it's lockstep with GDP. If you're looking at the graphite foil market, so once again, this is in the back of all your television screens and iPods and whatnot. That particular market is where the highest end graphite is. So you get the highest price premium for that material that expands, that graphite foil expanded material. That's about 10% of the market. And then, of course, lithium-ion batteries, that's what everybody's looking at right now. That market's a little over 20% of the total graphite market. But what's interesting about that particular market is it's growing leaps and bounds. So it's about 20 to 25% growth rate per year. So it's kind of interesting. In the next few years, it's going to eclipse the volume demands for the refractory industry. So you're really getting the whole graphite industry kind of pivoting over to more of a technological play away from industrial minerals.
Still with basics. So was there many traditional suppliers that were in the space, before NextSource came along?
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, what's interesting about the graphite world is about 2/3 of all the graphite produced in the world comes from China, like so many other commodities, but it's one of the few commodities that actually China has within its own borders. So they've basically cornered the market in the graphite world probably in the last 50 years or so, consolidated that. And then now with the advent and the growth of the lithium-ion battery industry, it's a very strategic resource for not only the Chinese, but every other Western world now as well, because you're getting that pivot basically from internal combustion engines or the ICE engines to EVs. And graphite is essential for that. And where the Chinese really dominate is they do 100% of the value add processing for graphite. So really quickly, the processing basically kind of route for that is you start off with a flake graphite, and then you have to do what's called spheronization. So you basically make small spheres out of that graphite, then you purify it, and then you coat it with the synthetic graphite rind around that, and that goes into the anode material. So that whole kind of middle portion of the whole value add chain is dominated by the Chinese.
What's interesting looking at the EV material space, and you've mentioned already, it's just that the chemistry is very important. You just have to have this, enhanced refining process for what you're generating.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. So, I mean, the chemistry is a little bit different with graphite mineralization, once again, because it's tagged off with other kind of esoteric type of criteria. So if you're looking in the lithium-ion battery space, for example, the graphite has to be very high purity with carbon, but it can't have deleterious elements that will basically make the battery run away, thermal runaway. So you're looking at iron, vanadium. You don't want any of those in your graphite mineralization whatsoever. And then, of course, it has to have high charge capacity and so on and so forth.
Is there any substitutes out there for graphite?
So there's natural graphite and there's also synthetic graphite. So synthetic graphite you can make basically from coke fines. What you do is you subject it to very, very high temperatures in an Atchison furnace, basically bake it for 2 to 3 weeks at very, very high temperatures, and it crystallizes into very high purity carbon. It does not have the same crystal structure, however, as natural flake graphite. So what happens there is the graphite that you get from synthetic graphite is very well used to basically produce torque in lithium-ion battery, whereas natural flake graphite gives you the range. And so it's a blend of actually the two. So you use natural flake graphite and synthetic graphite. Tesla's formulation just went from 50% natural to 50% synthetic. And they've actually just switched that, I believe it was about 6 months ago, to 60% natural and 40% synthetic. I was just going to say the silicon content, everybody's talking about the advent of silicon going into the battery chemistries now. What happens with silicon is silicon expands 400 times once you start getting lithium intercalated with the silicon. So what they do to mitigate that is natural flake graphite will soak up that expansion where synthetic graphite does not. So there's actually a limit that how much silicon you can put into a battery, because you want that for more charge capacity. So the more silicon they put, the more natural flake graphite they put, and the silicon content is not going to go higher than 10%. So when you say, is there, I guess, a risk of a replacement? Not really. I mean, all of these things, they kind of go hand in hand.
You're growing the mine right now. Maybe you could talk about over the next 12 months and some of the milestones you're going to be hitting at NextSource.
Yeah, absolutely. So the mine will be commissioning in the second quarter of next year. And once again, that's for 17,000 tons. And so that's a flake graphite concentrate that we'll be putting out of the back of that plant, once again, going half to the refractory industry through thyssenkrupp and then half through our lithium-ion battery partners into the Tesla supply chain. What's really interesting with the whole Tesla supply chain angle, though, as well, is that we have a three-way collaboration with basically the trader for Hitachi, as well as the Chinese group that does the spheronization and purification for Tesla right now. And so actually what we're doing right now is we're doing a technical study to quantify the cost of the replication of that exact facility in a different jurisdiction. So we're looking, of course, at all the regular suspects, so looking at the European markets, in North America, anywhere where really there's OEMs. And what's interesting is you've got a lot of governmental agencies that are actively trying to get battery supply into their borders right now. I mean, you just had this recent, I guess, fallout with the electronics going into vehicles and the whole chip shortage. And what that has really illustrated to all of the OEMs right now is that their supply chain is very, very important. They have to mitigate the risks associated with having that cut off by having different suppliers. And graphite is very important in the fact that it's the anode in their batteries. People are switching over to electric vehicles away from internal combustion. And 100% of the value add processing of that graphite is done in China right now. So we have a very unique position in the fact that we actually have the group that does the purification, the spheronization for Tesla right now in China. And we can replicate that exact facility in a different jurisdiction and basically start. And what that does too is it shortens off the time required to verify that material with the OEMs, because that's a very, very long process.
Craig Scherba, thank you for speaking with Kitco.
It was an absolute pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
Craig is CEO of NextSource Materials. My name is Michael McRae, and you are watching Kitco News.